The topic for today's video is death. Not exactly the video I wanted to open up my new YouTube channel with, but I just barely finished this book called The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker. It covers mostly the work of Otto Rank. Otto Rank was a psychoanalyst. He was one of the closest colleagues of Sigmund Freud and one of his successors. Sadly, he's one of the lesser known successors. More people are familiar with the work of Carl Jung and Alfred Adler. Ernest Becker, he was kind of an outcast. A lot of people discredit his work, and the last 10 years of his life, he didn't get a lot of recognition. In fact, it wasn't until he won the Pulitzer Prize for writing this book in 1974 that people really start paying attention to the work he was doing. Unfortunately, though, he won that award 2 months after he had already died, after a long fight against cancer. As a forewarning, this book is real heavy. Ernest Becker will go on for pages and pages and pages just talking about how insignificant we are. It takes a while to get to the real good stuff, in my opinion. The main thesis of this book is that our basic motivation for doing almost anything in life is out of our fear and anxiety that we have towards death. He opens up the book by going into, at times, excruciating detail, explaining what he calls the human condition. And I want to read a passage from that book so you can get kind of a feel for the way he writes. On a macrocosmic level, the consciousness of living, the dim awareness that we are alive for a moment on this planet as it spins meaningless around the cold and infinite galaxy, gives human beings the status of a small god in nature. Yet, at the same time, as the Eastern sages also knew, man is a worm and food for worms. This is the paradox. He is out of nature and hopelessly in it. He is dual up in the stars, and yet housed in a heart-pumping, breath-gasping body that once belonged to a fish and still has the gill marks to prove it. Man is literally split in two. He has awareness of his own splendid uniqueness, in that he sticks out of nature with a towering majesty, and yet he goes back into the ground a few feet in order blindly and dumbly to rot and despair forever. It is a terrifying dilemma to be in and to have to live with. Pretty heavy stuff. He then goes on to describe what he calls the two basic fears that all people have, and that's the fear of life. The way I interpreted the fear of life is the fear of life is like the fear of separation and individualization. The second fear that he says all human beings have is the fear of death, and that's the fear of union, essentially like the fear of losing one's individuality. Fear of death, I get, like everybody that's sane is afraid of death, but I had a really hard time trying to wrap my head around the fear of life. And it wasn't until recently when I heard a talk by Professor Jordan B. Peterson that I feel like it really started to make sense to me. In that talk, he told a story about a group of researchers that went to Africa, and they were studying zebras. And zebras on the surface, when you really think about them, are kind of weird. I mean, they've got white and black stripe patterns that stand out against the plains of Africa. So the researchers were studying this herd of zebras, and they're staring at one of the zebras, and they look down at their clipboard and they start making some notes. And when they look back up, they realize that they can't tell which zebra they were staring at. So the researchers are like, well, I got a sweet idea. I'm gonna go and put a tag on one of the zebras to help identify it. And as soon as they did that, it wasn't long after before a lion came and just ate that zebra. What they learned was the zebra stripes actually help camouflage them against the herd. When they're grouped together, a predator such as a lion can't really tell the difference between them. They just look like one big jumbled white and black striped mess. It's not until they identified it that they were able to single them out and kill them. There is a real fear when one takes a chance and tries to go outside the norms. It's easier just to kind of keep your head down and blend in. Where the book gets really interesting to me, he says that each individual has that yearning to try and find meaning and purpose in their life. The problem arises though when we can't find that meaning and purpose in the physical world. When we can't find it in the physical world, Ernest Becker suggests that we reach to the symbolic. Becker describes these pursuits as immortality projects. It's this urge for immortality that causes us to do pretty much everything. It manifests itself through our creativity, whether that's through our writings, our books, building giant skyscrapers. Even having children and starting a family can be looked at as having an immortality project. It's all these things that we do leaves us wanting to leave our mark on the world. It's kind of like we're writing our names, etching them into a tree. We do this because we want people to know that at some point we lived and we mattered. The real problem though is what happens when these symbols fail us. This is a part of the book that I found most fascinating, because what happens when my immortality project doesn't align with your immortality project? What if we have differing ideas? Who's right? Because ultimately only one of us can be right. What happens when I feel like I've no longer aligned myself to an idea that's going to last forever? Becker describes that as the symbolic death, and what it does is it creates a fight or flight reaction. Becker also noted that many of the greatest evils that we've ever seen on this planet in our history is due to people trying to protect those symbols, trying to protect those ideas that will grant them immortality. Tolerance can be a pretty ambitious goal given all the differences between us. Just the simple fact that other people have ideas that differ from me really caused me to examine my own belief system, and that doesn't always feel good. So what do? One of the ways people try and diffuse this threat is by belittling, making fun of the other people. If we can just kind of push them down, then it makes me feel good about myself, But if that doesn't work, then one of the ways that we can deal with this threat is by trying to force them to assimilate. And you see this in things like missionary work, for example. But if we can't force them to assimilate, then, what other options do we have? I think the only thing left on the table is annihilation. A great example of our cultural and national immortality projects being under attack was during 9/11. I remember, in the days, weeks, months, years after 9/11, there was a huge upswing in patriotism. People were waving their flags, they were attached to their cars, everybody was very pro-America. As a result, even support for Bush went up tremendously. And as we know, what followed was an aggressive reaction to us being attacked. When you really think about it, all the confirmed deaths by every serial killer throughout all history aren't even a drop in the bucket compared to all the deaths that have been a result of loyalty, patriotism, love of God or country. So those were the basic ideas that were covered in this book. As a result of Becker writing this book, it had a huge impact on social psychology. Many people wanting to prove the theories laid out in this book have created this whole other field in social psychology, and that's called terror management theory. There have been over, 200 published studies that have been done trying to prove that the anxiety and fear that people have towards death will have a huge impact on their behaviors. I think what I'll do is I'll link to some of the studies that I found most interesting in the comments below, and if you're interested, take a look at some of that. Alright, so what are the main takeaways? I mean, I thought about this book a lot, and I think that what it really has done for me is that it's caused me to think a lot about my own mortality. It's also caused me to think a lot about what are the ideas that I hold really close to my heart that I would consider my immortality projects, because I think it'll help me to know the areas where I'm most vulnerable, areas that I feel like I might be more quick to retaliate if I feel like those ideas are being threatened. A lot of people think to themselves, I don't even worry about death because I don't even think about it. With how much we're bombarded in the news, the media, TV, movies about death, I think the thought of death is constantly being placed into our heads, but it's in our subconscious and we are just repressing it. So rather than repress it, I think a more healthy thing to do would be to confront it. In medieval times, Christians would follow this practice called memento mori, when translated means remember that one has to die. Medieval monks would do the same thing by keeping skulls on their desks while they were writing. Well, I don't know why I did this. They weren't typing, they were actually writing. And in Tibet and those areas, they would drink out of like these chalices. I don't know if that's the right word, like a skull cup. I think a lot of these people believed that by doing these practices, it allowed them to really confront death and live life on their own terms rather than live in just constant subconscious denial. I really do believe that the amount of death terror or death anxiety that one person has is related and correlated to the amount of unlived life that person feels that they have. But I think rather than just pushing that down deep and pretending like it doesn't exist, accept it. Realize that our time is precious. It can be taken at any moment and use it. Find things that help bring value and purpose in your life. Like go join a cult or join the army. Do whatever it is that you got to do to be able to find a sense of purpose in your life. I appreciate your time. Just so you know, I'm not entirely sure of how my channel is gonna unfold, but not all of them are going to be like book reports like this. I'm really into things like science and futurology. I'm sure a lot of my videos will cover that. I'm also really into history, and I will cover some books as well. So if that kind of stuff really interests you guys, then I hope to see you around. And if not, well, have a wonderful life. Take care. One last thing, sorry about the audio quality and also for what felt like at times my random incoherent thoughts. Turns out making a video is way harder than I thought it would be. Promise that I'm gonna try and get better. Maybe though, I'll think about that and have a little bit of compassion next time I'm clicking that dislike button on a YouTube video, but let's be honest, probably not. Peace!